From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast for the Wall Street Journal opinion page. And 1 week after a momentous election, I am delighted to be here with Tom Bevan, who's a co-founder and executive editor of RealClearPolitics. Tom, RCP is a go-to for me every day. During an election season, it's a go-to many, many times a day, not just to see your polling averages, but also all of the original content you guys have on the site. I want to dive more broadly into the elections and their consequences in a minute, but just briefly, one thing that I like to think about RCP is that, dare I say, its humble approach to the polls, in that it doesn't claim to have some fancy model that's going to tell you that Kamala Harris has precisely a 54.6% chance of winning the election. You guys you go out there, you take the public polling, not private, not sponsored polling, but you take the public polls, you aggregate it, you give an average. And I would argue that by and large, your results have consistently been better indicators than those models. Would you agree? But also, a number of polls really did get it wrong again this time. What do you think? What went wrong?
Well, first of all, thank you. It was a very kind introduction. I think there is something to, and our averages have been more accurate than anyone over the course of the last 20 years. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we do just produce a simple average, right? There's no secret sauce. It's not a black box. We're not doing any weighting or manipulating of pollsters. And then obviously we don't do the forecasting. And these Bayesian models that Nate Silver and 538 run, where they run all these simulations and come, Kamala Harris wins 40,000 15 times out of 80,000 simulations, which is what they had this year.
And how'd that work out?
Exactly. I do think just taking a simple average, and even, again, with our averages, they are only as good as the polls that are within them. And so we did have the New York Times, for example, which in their defense, they were good in 2022 and 2018. But like a lot of the so-called, A-plus quality pollsters, for 3 straight cycles have not been able to get it right when it comes to Donald Trump. They've underestimated his support consistently across the board. And that happened again this year. But we do include with equal weight, right? We put in, Rasmussen and Atlas Intel and Trafalgar and Insider Advantage. And those pollsters have been more accurate over the last 3 cycles than anybody. And so whereas a site like 538 or one of our competitors would be de-emphasizing, right, the sort of Republican-leaning pollsters and giving them bad grades and therefore decreasing the amount of influence that they have within their averages, we don't do that. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've been as successful as we have been and more accurate than any of our competitors over time, is because we, to your point, it's sort of a humble approach, right? It's the sort of KISS principle, keep it simple, don't get all of these sort of fancy bells and whistles that people have attached to their averages and their models. Really don't make them any accurate, and in a lot of instances actually make them less accurate. But to your point, there were a number of pollsters. CNN had a terrible cycle. I mean, they had, Kamala Harris winning some of these swing states by 6 points. She lost them by anywhere from 1 to 3 points, depending on the state. And those were part of the averages. And look, it's a problem, and we get this all the time. You should exclude those people. You should not let them in your averages. And I get that. But at the same time, if we just sort of threw out polls that we disagreed with or that gave a result that was at odds with some of the other polls in the field at the same time, that could also end up being a problem and come back to bite us as well. And so it's a delicate balance. We do our best at it. And I think, as you said, we do it as well or better than anyone else out there.
Well, the other thing that's nice about it, too, is that we always have to remember that, and the pollsters like to say this as well, that they are not predictors, that in fact they give you instead a sense of where things are moving. And one thing that if you were religiously going to RCP every day, which I did, you could see that movement in the end toward Donald Trump and possibly see where this was headed. And that's another great thing about the way you guys track and keep your polls. So More broadly, presidency obviously now set, a pretty stunning victory. Democrats, the recriminations are flying, and I've been really struck by something. Their loss in 2016, there appeared to be zero reflection afterward. It was this instantaneous movement to the resistance, Russia collusion, we have a dictator in office, how do we stop him? This time, 8 years later, I am seeing a bit of a reckoning instead. Now, part of it is just, well, no, Trump has won, and that was because we made technical errors. But I've been really struck by the fact that a significant number of Democrats are, and maybe this is because of the magnitude of his victory, movement even in some blue states. I mean, for goodness sake, the man only lost New Jersey by 5 points, that we are seeing some internal reflection in that party. And some people actually saying we've lost a connection with the working class. We've got to ditch all this cultural woke stuff. Who emerges out of this, do you think, as the new voice, the new face of the Democratic Party? What does it look like?
Oh, that is a great question. I think it's still to be determined. I agree with you. I mean, I do think that, 2016, Trump didn't win the popular vote. It was close in these states. And I think Democrats thought, well, if Hillary Clinton had just gone to Wisconsin or something, she would have been president. And so they didn't really offer much by way of course correction. And certainly after 2020, they didn't. But this time it is different because you did have these significant swings among Black men and Latinos and younger voters in ways that really did, shift the landscape, to your point, not just in swing states, but in some of these blue states. And we were seeing, I live in Illinois. I mean, the fact that Illinois was only 8.5 points was astonishing. And Donald Trump got, over 20% in the city of Chicago. And that's amazing.
Not if you rode in a cab in Chicago anytime soon. They
true,
were all telling me they were going to vote for Trump.
But so what does the future look like for Democrats? I mean, that's the problem, I think, because if you think back to who stood on that stage with Joe Biden and who would be standing on the stage 4 years from now to run for president, it's going to be the same general cast of characters, right? Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, J.B. Pritzker, maybe. Can any of those people reestablish a connection with the working class that Democrats have lost? I don't think so. Now, maybe Gretchen Whitmer is the answer, or maybe there will be someone else. Fetterman has been mentioned. He's clearly the only one in the Democratic Party right now who has any sort of grasp on the working class, but I'm not even sure he's ready or willing to put himself up to be president. I'm not sure how that would go, but even folks like Sherrod Brown and John Tester, right, who did have connections to the working class. They got overwhelmed by Republican turnout. And so I don't know the answer to that question. And if they try and nominate someone who is not able to reconnect with the working class, I don't think it's going to go well for them. And I think some of the shifts that we've seen might continue. I mean, obviously 4 years is a long time, but it's a serious problem and they need to address it. And we'll see how well and whether they do it.
Your point about John Fetterman is the one that I think is going to matter in the immediate going forward, because it's what Bernie Sanders is now saying. I think they put aside some of this cultural wokeism and really amp up economic populism. That's much more of the Fetterman mold. And it struck me that was also what this Dan Osborne character in Nebraska was running as. You have to get rid of some of the cultural stuff to reconnect, but then you really double down on what you do for the working class in terms of big government. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back, more with Tom Bevan from RealClearPolitics. Welcome back. I am Kim Strassel here with All Things, and I have as my guest this week Tom Bevan of RealClearPolitics. So Trump's nomination picks are already coming hot and heavy. Just in the last 5 days, we've had almost 10 of them. Everyone from, Elise Stefanik for United Nations. He's got a chief of staff. Mike Waltz is national security advisor. Former Congressman Lee Zeldin at EPA. A couple of border picks. A couple of things stick out here to me. One is simply the speed of this, which seems to be sending a message in and of itself, which is that we were planning for this moment moment. We are ready and we're going to hit day one running at a sprint. But the other thing that really strikes me about these picks is that despite all the kind of warnings from the left, they're not weird or crazy. I mean, these guys, a lot of them are people who've been around a long time. They have some real experience in the field that they're being chosen for. A lot of them really do have a lot of experience. Who, if any, has been a surprise to you, if there is anyone? And what do you make of the field so far?
Well, I agree with you. It's moving fast, and that signals that I think Trump is going to be in a hurry. And he's signaled this already, talking about wanting recess appointment power from the Senate, and everybody needs to sort of get along and get on the train because it's already moving down the tracks, and he wants to move as quickly as he can to do as much as he can. And I agree with you. I think most of these picks have been good picks, and they've definitely signaled that he's getting people in there, the people that he wants, the people that he knows, I think will be loyal to him, do a good job. The one pick that stood out to me is the Kristi Noem pick for Department of Homeland Security, and someone was just telling me they haven't even he hasn't released a statement on that.
Yeah.
So it may not actually be like a done deal. So we'll have to wait and see. But that definitely surprised me because, A, I'm not sure what relevant experience she has for that position. And obviously, she was sort of cast out in the wilderness after her disastrous book tour with the story about Kim Jong-un, which appears to be made up or she wouldn't comment on, and the, killing of the puppy. She had kind of been out there, sort of exiled back to South Dakota. So that would be a pretty remarkable turn of events for her. But everyone else seems to be someone that you look at and they're not out of left field. They are right in the sort of sweet spot of people who are qualified for their respective positions and who are Trump loyalists, even if they weren't at one time, like a Marco Rubio, a former rival, is now firmly in Trump's camp.
The other thing about these initial picks is how much they also reflect those issues that Trump kept saying were going to be his priority when he got into office. So we've had a whole bundle of national security picks. Obviously, he cares deeply about doing something, we don't know what yet, but doing something about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, for instance, trying to reestablish some global order, as it were. Energy, the Lee Zeldin pick, is clearly a key position for deregulation that he would need for more energy production and reviving Detroit. And then, as you note, Homeland Security and the border, he has both his border czar and that Kristi Noem pick. The Kristi Noem pick brings up another question, because I agree with you. It surprised me, too. That would be one where I wouldn't say there was a ton of experience there. But it gets to this question. So as a lot of people have been talking about cabinet positions, they talk about the broad universe of right-leaning people who could get picked. I've also been trying to look at this from the other direction, which is, where does he put some people that he clearly needs to put as a recognition of their support throughout the campaign? And I think Kristi Noem might be an example of that, sort of looking around saying, okay, here was a loyal person and it didn't work out as a possible Veep, but she's been at my side all this time. I need to put her somewhere. Oh, okay, Homeland Security. But what do you do as well with folks like Vivek Ramaswamy or RFK Jr. or Elon Musk or Tulsi Gabbard? Any thoughts where those folks can end up? Because he's going to feel the need to put them somewhere.
I agree. And I actually thought, I was just having a conversation with someone before this podcast about that exact question. Tulsi Gabbard might have actually made more sense at Homeland Security. I mean, I don't think she can do defense. I don't think. So where would he put her? Where can she be helpful to him? Same thing with RFK. I mean, is he really going to be HHS? That might be a bridge too far, but if he's not that, then what? Do they just get named respective czars? RFK becomes the health czar or something? And Vivek's another example of a guy who's clearly talented and got to find a spot for him somewhere in the administration. So it's going to be interesting. It's an open question. I agree with you. And it'll be interesting to see how he tries to work these people into, because that was one of the narratives of this campaign, right? The sort of the Avengers, this odd sort of heterodox mix of, supporters from Tucker to Joe Rogan to Tulsi Gabbard to RFK versus Kamala Harris, Beyonce, and Liz Cheney, right? It was like choose your fighters.
The Avengers. Who's the Hulk in this scenario?
I don't know. I think I stole that from Miranda Devine or someone at the New York Post had mentioned the Avengers. But it was a really interesting mix of people who came forward to support Trump. Not just Elon, but, Bill Sachs and David Ackman and some of these other guys that were popular on social media. But I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did.
We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more on the fallout from last week's election.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel, and I'm here with Tom Bevan of RealClearPolitics. One interesting position I've heard mentioned with regard to Vivek Ramaswamy is Secretary of Education, which I think that could just be fun, especially because he said you should get rid of it. So, hey, why not, right?
Why not?
Moving on to the Senate, it looks pretty set, 53-seat Republican majority. And more interesting to me in the short term now is that we've got a Senate leadership race tomorrow morning, Wednesday morning at 9:30 a.m. This is big because Mitch McConnell is the longest serving leader in the Senate. He has been the face of the Republican Senate for 18 years. So this is really a new chapter. And as we went into this, everyone basically had the view it was South Dakota Senator John Thune's to lose. Although I think fighting a pretty tough re-election match with Senator John Cornyn. Both of those men notably have served as whip in the Senate conference, which is another way of saying that they have deep relationships with most of the other members, because that's what the whip does, is they spend a lot of time talking to their colleagues, getting them all on the same page on various issues. The long shotter was Rick Scott from Florida, who has been a longtime critic of Mitch McConnell and unsuccessfully challenged him for the leadership job a couple of years ago. There's been this late-breaking blitz surge of these outside folks, from Tucker Carlson to Elon Musk, saying, go Rick Scott, he needs to be the Senate leader. I don't see that happening. And in fact, it would seem that some of this pylon is actually making senators a bit irritable. They don't like all the people calling into their office and protesting outside their door. And this is a secret vote. But how do you think this is going to play out?
I agree with you. I mean, I think it's probably still a long shot, but he does have the support of, Marco Rubio and Ron Johnson and Rand Paul and some other, Rick Scott does. And so it's not just a purely, sort of outsider influence campaign that's going on. And listen, Mitch McConnell is, I was going to say disliked, but I think despised is maybe the more appropriate word by large swaths of the MAGA base, Republican rank and file. I mean, they just don't like him. They think he's been working at odds with Trump and his agenda, and quite frankly, even some of these Senate races over the last couple cycles, he has. And, the question is, well, how much of that is going to continue under a John Cornyn or a John Thune? Right. I mean, the one thing that, as we just talked about with Trump making all these appointments, trying to move quickly, they want to have, with a unified caucus in the House where Republicans are going to have a 3-seat majority, maybe 4 at most, and a unified caucus in the Senate. They're still obviously going to have to face the filibuster there legislatively, but it certainly is going to be a lot better for Republicans and Trump and his agenda to have a leadership that is on the same page and moving in the same direction, as opposed to working at sort of potentially at odds or undermining, as I think a lot of people thought Mitch McConnell had been doing to Trump when he was in office and even when he was out of office. So I think it's an important vote, and we'll see how it turns out. Maybe there's a surprise in there. I mean, maybe Rick Scott can actually pull this off. As you mentioned, secret vote, it's sort of very opaque and we can kind of read the tea leaves, but that's the kind of thing where it's ripe for a potential upset if people decide to go in there and move in a new direction, which they may do. You never know.
Yeah, I find that a harder scenario only, and here's why. Let me give you my reasons. You named the people who have said that they're voting for him. And for the most part, those who are voting for him, they have been public about it because I think they want that approval, right, from the base to sort of say, look, hey, I'm a Rick Scott supporter. I'm on the side opposite of Mitch McConnell, as it were. But even with this sort of onslaught, other than I think Bill Hagerty, the senator, came out and said he's supporting him, you haven't really seen anyone else do that. I think the Senate's just a weird body where they kind of prize having a leader that's going to talk to them all and try to unify them a little bit more than bomb throwing. I think it's just a little different from the House in that way. My hope here is that I think what's most important if Trump wants to get his agenda across is that they come out of this not fractious and divided and throwing insults at each other, because they got a lot of work they got to get done.
Well, but Trump's also sort of sticking his nose. He and his folks have been, inserting themselves into, as you mentioned, senators don't really like that. And they get a little prickly when traditionally the president sort of stays out of this stuff and lets them do their thing. But I think Trump's been a little more vocal. And I think his folks have been working a little bit more aggressively behind the scenes to try and, have some influence on this vote.
Yeah, but notably he has not come out, at least so far, and said anything. And I think he's not going to endorse because he doesn't want to be on the wrong side of this vote.
Right.
And that makes some sense. Going over to the House quickly, it looks as though right now, I know that different outfits have called and not called races, but it does seem likely that House Republican majority will be returning, although hilariously in my mind, probably with about the same majority that it went into this election having. So basically we had a 4-seat Republican majority, and hundreds of millions of dollars later, we're going to have basically a 4-seat Republican majority. And I should note too, almost all of the same places. Very few places actually changed direction. But I want to ask you, just because it's kind of a corollary to the Senate question, the last 2 years have been this almost parody comedy at times in the House of that slim Republican majority attempting to bring itself together and failing again and again with all this drama over the speakers and being speakerless for weeks, and, Mike Johnson. And it looks as though he's going to be renominated as speaker, and he'll probably have those 218 votes when the full House votes in January. But my question to you is, do you think with Trump in the presidency that some of that calms down, and that even though they only have a 4-seat majority, that there is a little bit more discipline on that side just by dint of the fact that there's now someone calling the shots and setting out an agenda in the White House?
I think so. I do. I mean, I definitely think, because with Trump, when he was not in office, right, there was no, I was going to say adult in the room, but I'm not sure that's how people would always describe Trump, right? But the Republicans were sort of left to their own devices, particularly in the House. But now with him in there and his staff and his picks and him driving the agenda and basically telling these folks, look, this is what I want done, he can be working some of these members, and I think there will be a lot more unity and a lot more discipline. And I suspect that will there still be some little kerfuffles here and there between these, competing factions in the House? Sure. But I think they're going to be minimized and much fewer and further between, because Trump will be, as you said, driving this agenda from the top. And I just think there'll be much more discipline. I agree with that.
We may get a test of that. I saw a headline just today based on anonymous sources that some of those House rebels might take another run at Mike Johnson in early January to see if they can't dethrone him. And I just don't see Trump wanting to go there and start his new agenda with that kind of fight. I don't know what you think about that.
I was talking to someone earlier and they said they didn't think Mike Johnson was going to be speaker, which I was like, really? I would not put my money on that. I think he's the heavy favorite to return as speaker. I think that would be a real shock. And to your point, not the symbolic start to the new Congress that Republicans would want, to have more turnover and more chaos with their tiny House majority.
Wise words, Tom Bevan. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and give your wisdom to us today. I want to thank our listeners. We are here every week. We appreciate your tuning in. If you like the show, please do hit the subscribe button. And if you want to write to us, we're at pwpodcast@wsj.com.